March 23, 1994. Aeroflot Flight 593 was a scheduled passenger flight operating from Moscow to Hong Kong. Everything was going normal, and passengers were sleeping. Then the captain invited his children into the cockpit to see his place of work. At that point, although the aircraft was flying on autopilot, the innocent children made some terrible mistakes that Flight 593 might not ever reach its destination. You'll never guess what happened on that flight. Stay tuned to discover the harrowing story of how a seemingly innocent invitation to the flight deck led to an unimaginable event. The flight was being flown that night by an Airbus A310-300 aircraft, operated by Aeroflot Russian International Airlines, an autonomous division of the Russian national carrier Aeroflot, to operate modern Western aircraft routes between Russia, Southeast Asia, and Europe. The flight's departure from Moscow at 16:39 local time was on time and uneventful, with also two innocent children of Captain Kudrinsky who were on their first international trip. At this point, the aircraft was flying on autopilot mode as it cruised towards its destination with sleeping passengers in the dead of night, soon settling down for the 9-hour-long night flight to Hong Kong. Flight 593 flight deck crew was made up of 3 pilots. The captain was Andrei Viktorovich Danilov, aged 40, who had flown for Aeroflot since November 1992 and had over 9,500 hours of flying experience in total, including 950 hours in the A310. Second in command was First Officer Igor Vasilyevich Piskaryov, aged 33, who had flown for the airline since October 1993 and had 5,885 hours of flight time, including 440 hours in the A310. The relief pilot was Captain Yaroslav Vladimirovich Kudrinsky, aged 39. Kudrinsky, who had accrued over 8,940 flying hours, with 907 hours in the A310. In addition to the 3 flight crew members, 9 flight attendants were working in the cabin of Flight 593. On Flight 593 that night were a total of 75 people, comprising 63 passengers and 12 crew. Of the 63 passengers flying to Hong Kong, 40 were Russian nationals, including 30 employees of Aeroflot, with the balance made up largely of business travelers from Hong Kong and Taiwan heading home after meetings in Russia. Shortly after midnight on March 23, 1994, with the flight cruising at 33,000 feet, 10,100 meters, Relief Captain Kudrinsky had taken over command of Flight 593, with Captain Danilov resting in the cabin. Kudrinsky invited his 2 children, who were flying with him to Hong Kong as passengers, to join him on the flight deck of the A310. At this point, there were 5 people in the flight deck made up of Kudrinsky, his 2 children, son Eldar, aged 15, and daughter Yana, aged 13. First Officer Piskaryov, plus a 3rd off-duty Aeroflot pilot, Vladimir Makarov, who had escorted the children into the flight deck. Contrary to Aeroflot flying regulations, Kudrinsky let each of his 2 children sit in the left-hand seat of the aircraft in turn, facing the controls. At 0043, Yana took her father's seat first, with Kudrinsky manually adjusting the autopilot's heading setting to create the impression that Yana was flying the plane. After a few more minutes, Yana vacated the seat for her older brother Eldar to face the controls. For reasons unknown, Kudrinsky allowed Eldar to manipulate the controls, presumably in the belief that the autopilot was flying the plane and that any control inputs from Eldar would have no effect. Inside the aircraft, around 0054, Eldar applied strong force to the control stick for over 30 seconds, which conflicted with the autopilot's efforts to keep the plane on course. This caused the aircraft's ailerons to switch to manual control, though no one in the cockpit realized it. As the autopilot tried to correct the plane's heading, it clashed with Eldar's inputs, leading to the disconnection of the autopilot from the aileron controls. A warning light illuminated the cockpit, but the pilots failed to notice it due to their unfamiliarity with the aircraft's systems. Under Eldar's forceful inputs, the plane began banking right at a dangerous rate, eventually reaching a 45-degree angle. The aircraft started to buffet, catching Captain Kudrinski's attention. He ordered the co-pilot to take control while attempting to get Eldar out of the pilot's seat. The co-pilot struggled to adjust his seat, and by the time he did, the bank angle had increased to a critical 90 degrees. The plane started to descend rapidly, and despite the autopilot's efforts to correct the dive, it eventually disengaged completely. First Officer Piskaryov managed to pull the aircraft out of the dive, but in his haste, he overcorrected, causing the plane to enter a near-vertical climb, leading to a stall and subsequent spin. The crew managed to recover from the spin twice, but the plane lost significant altitude, descending below the minimum safe altitude over mountainous terrain. At 0059, air traffic controllers noticed the aircraft had disappeared from radar, and all attempts to contact the flight went unanswered. Aeroflot Flight 593 crashed in a flat attitude at high vertical speed, estimated to be around 70 meters per second, 250 kilometers per hour. The location of the accident site was in the Kuznetsk-Alatau mountain range in the Kemerovo Oblast region of southern Russia, about 20 kilometers from the town of Mezhdurachensk. All 75 people on board died as a result of the high-speed impact. The aircraft was completely destroyed. 2 hours later, a report reached the authorities that burning aircraft wreckage had been spotted on a remote mountainside some 20 kilometers southeast of the town of Mezhdurachensk. A team of rescuers subsequently trekked to the crash site, where they were met with a scene of devastation consisting of smoldering aircraft wreckage, scorched forest, and human remains. In the days following the loss of Flight 593, families of the passengers and crew visited the site to leave floral tributes to honor the dead. The aircraft's 2 flight recorders were recovered 2 days after the crash. Having originally denied reports that there had been children in the flight deck of the doomed aircraft. At the time of the crash, Aeroflot was forced to quickly change their account of events involving Flight 593. When, in September 1994, a Moscow-based newspaper published a leaked copy of the cockpit voice recorder transcript.
Now, come and sit in my seat. Would you like to?
Daddy, can I turn, please?
Yeah.
As with most aviation accidents, there was no singular cause that led to the loss of Aeroflot Flight 593. The accident was ultimately the tragic result of a combination of factors that, in isolation, may not have resulted in the loss of the aircraft and all on board, but when occurring in rapid succession, led to a situation that proved to be unrecoverable for the crew. Should have remained an innocent cockpit visit of curious and excited children visiting their father's place of work, they ended with a tragedy of unimaginable consequences.